Hello and welcome to another Plus Sized Kite Review. Today I'm going to be focusing on the Harlem Force, while comparing it mainly to the Orbit Pro, the Cabrina Nitro V2, and my Duotone Evo D-Lab. So I would certainly recommend anyone joining this series for the first time to go back and watch those videos, as I tend to reference my previous videos often. As always though, let's start with a quick update and some housekeeping. I'll get the ball rolling with a humble request to please like, comment, and subscribe, or even follow me on Instagram for more up-to-date snippets of what I'm testing next. Your comments are always really appreciated, and it certainly helps with the views and to inspire other brands to get involved in my reviews. For those of you who don't know, our windy season in New Zealand is from June to October, so as the weather gets colder, we will get a lot more 25 to 30 knot, more days, and I hopefully have lined up a few more 2024 kites to review over the season, which means a lot more content more often, and less time in between them. As always, it helps if you mention below what kites you want me to be riding, and more interestingly, which kites you would like me to compare with each other, e.g. the Evo D-Lab versus the XR Pro. And yes, I am still working on getting my hands on one for some tests. I am also still working on the Woo vs Surfer review that I put on hold because of the great SpaceX video on the subject, even though I have some differing opinions and findings to them. Since then, I have put a lot more water time into riding both devices together, including adding in the board mount from Surfer, and I have added some more time on my older Woo 3 versus Woo 4 versus Surfer board mount all at the same time. So I have a ridiculous amount of footage to go through and data to consider, but I'm working on it, I promise. In my opinion, both of these products are great, so I want to make sure I'm as fair as possible and highlight all the favorite aspects of each. I have also spent a lot of my recent sessions riding and filming the North Navigator Pro Bar in conditions varying from 15 to 35 knots, so that will likely be my next video coming within the next week. I'll mainly be comparing the standard North Navigator bar, my Core Sensor 3 Pro bar, and my Duotone Trust bars. Now, with all that aside, let's get on to our featured kite, the Harlem Force. So I had the benefit of testing this over 5 sessions now, but unfortunately 4 of them were under 30 knots due to the summer conditions here in Auckland not being very favorable for big air. So in the end, some of us did a little road trip south for 8 hours to find the 30 to 35 knots I needed to really do a proper big air test. And I'm really glad I did, because that was when this kite came alive for me. I would imagine the first thing people would wonder about is if the fabric and the manufacturing technology is as advertised, and does it make a very noticeable difference to the feel and performance of the kite? And the short answer is yes, significantly. But like with a number of our recent kite tests, what kind of rider is really benefiting from this, of course, is a big question. And perhaps more importantly, does the kite design benefit as much as it could from the technology? Now, if you've watched my other videos and know what my personal quiver is, you'd know my feelings that performance-wise, so far the best overall example I've flown of where design maximizes new materials from the last few years has been the Evo D-Lab. I believe the Duotone team did spend a year developing that kite specifically for Alula, and it probably didn't hurt development to have some of the best riders of all time helping the design team with testing and feedback. Right off the bat, I can say there is a lot of similar feel with the Harlem in terms of the weight of the kite and the speed of the kite, and depending on your level with either of these kites, once you get used to that lighter feel and kite speed, it's very hard to go back to standard kites, and other kites start to feel like a lot more work than they need to be. I can imagine it's like what people thought of power steering when it was first starting to become more common in cars. It was strange at first, but quickly became familiar, and then after a while, it was only enthusiasts that didn't want to have it in their vehicle. So how does this Harlem kite compare overall to the Evo, and what other kites are the most similar in my estimation? Let's break it down a little. Let's start with what I think is the very closest comparison I could give in terms of other kites and overall performance to the Harlem. That would be the Orbit Pro. They both move at a similar pace in a very similar way and are closely comparable in everything from low end to boosting to looping and hang time. The most significant difference between the two would be that the Harlem feels and rides noticeably lighter, both on the bar and in the overall feel flying it around, which also translates to it moving a little bit faster, be it through the window, around a loop, or shooting up to 12 as you send it. Now, if you'll recall from my Orbit Pro review, I found this speed very challenging to get the hang of at first, but the performance reward you get from it is wonderful once you have. Just like the Orbit Pro, this kite is not as forgiving as similar style kites like the standard Orbit or Nitro version 2, and it can certainly punish you if you're caught slipping with your timing, particularly in more challenging gusty conditions. I was doing a bit of oversending on my boosts and loops at times, and of course struggled to get the kite very low on even the bigger, more powered kite loops with my 22-meter lines. On a couple occasions, I even screwed up my descending heli loops on scent jumps in the gustiest session and found myself falling out of the sky a little bit, something I can't recall doing in a long time on any of the recent kites I've used. In the lighter sessions, the Force felt to have less power than the Orbit Pro in the low end, but by a very small amount. And you could easily make the argument that it only felt that way because it's noticeably lighter in the overall weight of the kite and the bar pressure. When jumping in the lighter to moderate conditions, I only was finding about a 1 meter difference on the woo jumps up to around 15 meters, which can easily be attributed to wind or technique variation from jump to jump. But a couple of us both had similar results in that we could on average just get a little bit more height from the Orbit Pro. Another explanation for this slight disparity could be that we found the sweet spot on the Orbit Pro a little bit easier to hit when sending the kite up, likely because it's moving a touch slower as well. I made a similar comment on the Nitro version 2 versus the Orbit Pro review, that with all of these super fast kites these days, sometimes a little slower movement when sending actually makes it a bit easier for moderate level riders to hit that sweet spot. I would wager that a top tier rider is likely to go a little bit higher on the Harlem, because their timing is going to be a lot better and more consistent. But I don't think it would be that far off the Orbits or Nitros, perhaps less than 5% really. By the time I got to my session that was over 30 knots, I was certainly a lot more in tune with the kite, but I still struggled at times with timing the launches optimally, especially with the addition of hitting kickers. I did manage to crack 20 meters on my woo with one jump that I got just right, but I do feel like I would have fared a little bit better boosting on average if I was on the Orbit Pro or Nitro 2. And if you've watched my other videos, you would know the Evo D-Lab would be a whole other tier above these kites in terms of power, lift, and overall boosting potential. I would wager in the same conditions of say 30 to 35 knots, I would jump about the same, if not even a little bit higher, going down to my 8-meter Evo D-Lab, which is no surprise really. It costs 25 to 30% more, and has more top-heavy kind of bow shape, closer to an XR or Edge, which comes at a cost in the looping department, of course. Although I'm not sure exactly how it looked on screen when seeing it in real time, but from the beach where I was during last year's King of the Air, you could see the difference the Evo D-Lab was making in terms of height for the duotone team in almost every heat they faced other riders, and particularly in the final where Andrea was consistently out-jumping Lorenzo, even though he often wasn't hitting the best forming kickers. Lorenzo seems to have been doing a much better job of getting more optimum launches going to the left, but he couldn't just keep up with the height and lift the Evo was giving Andrea. I'm really curious to see what kind of height disparity there will be off flat water at the upcoming GKA events. Now, moving on to where this kite really shines, when it comes to loops, the Harlem would appear to be the tightest, fastest loop I've tested. Although again, it is very close to the Orbit Pro, and possibly the Ocean Rodeo Rise is right up there as well, but I did test that one almost 2 years ago now, so its super speed around the loop was likely quite relative to the kites I was trying at the time. With the Harlem, the super fast looping catching speed of course takes some getting used to, because you can oversend the kite a little bit or time it a bit incorrectly. But it does open the door to training loops without jumping as high as you need to with most other kites, and with a lot less pull because of the high angle of the kite rotation. I've mentioned before in the Orbit and Nitro reviews that the benefit of these faster, tighter looping kites is that when you are progressing in loops or loop variations, you don't need to commit as much risk by not having to jump as high to loop, or when pulling hard, you'll have a softer, higher angled loop ready to catch you super quickly. In comparison, even with my D-Lab, which although has as fast a moving kite, the shape tends to create a little more pull, and with poor timing can bobble or pause for a fraction of a second before coming up for the catch after a loop, as you can see here, even on my tiniest size, the 8-meter. Luckily, this kite moves so fast, it's very hard to get in trouble with this. unlike I used to at times on my old Core XR7 when it would do a similar pause, but for much longer after the loop before the ascent. As an example of what I was talking about a moment ago, here is a clip of a front roll with a nice late high-angled loop. It's got a very safe tight turning kite, and it catches me very easily, and I'm only about 5 meters in the air. There's hardly any pull, so if I stall or over-rotate, all I need to know to do is sheet out, and the likely odds are the kite will easily complete the loop and shoot up above my head and be on its way up above me to catch me and reduce the power of the crash. Another wonderful aspect of the overall weight reduction, bar pressure and speed of the kite, as demonstrated by my friend John here, is that pulling loops with one hand is far less intimidating because you're not feeling as much power in the bar and you can have a lot of confidence the kite is coming around to catch you. If I were to put my armchair kite assessment hat back on the pro level, I don't think anyone is going to argue with this kite. Lorenzo seems to be consistently pulling some of the sickest looking double and S-loop variations with an often ultra low fast moving kite. If we go back to that Coda final once more, although his height was lacking, his kite angle on the double loop variations was vastly more impressive to me, likely in part due to this kite's maneuverability through the loops with an almost guaranteed catch. Andrea seemed to have a habit of depowering the kite fractionally after his first loops on the doubles before the second loop, potentially to let it breathe a little and to keep the kite high enough that it won't bobble or stall slightly, especially when he's traveling a bit further downwind with more slack in the lines. To me, this is likely why we see so many high-angle doubles and S-loops from him, and often the free fall from them as well. The slight pause in the double will keep the kite higher and extend the height of his jumps, but at a cost of the impressive kite angle. The Evo's shape and this style would often contribute to the slack and free fall he's often seen with his kite ascents. I'm curious to hear everyone else's thoughts on this, because I think both styles are super impressive, but I would probably make the argument if the kites were reversed, we'd likely have seen a different winner at the end of the day. Now, with all the magic that is the looping prowess, like the Orbit Pro, the downside would be that the kite does suffer somewhat in the stability area and hang time department. Both kites can be challenging in gusty conditions, but I probably preferred the Harlem because it is lighter so you don't feel the gusts as dramatically, and it is slightly quicker to maneuver out of trouble. With hang time, I struggle to say which was better. They both allow you to do tight heli loops on a dime above the head. That is great fun while floating down from jumps and just zipping it around a few times as you descend. I had trouble doing board-offs with these kites because of the lack of hang time, but also because my skills lack in that area, as I've only just got into them in the recent months, and mostly on my Evo D-Labs, which have the best hang time on the market as far as I'm aware. I also found board-offs easier on the Nitro version 2 because it was a bit more stable and less likely to allow me to make the mistake of sending the kite out of the window too quickly, and thus run out of time to get the board back on my feet. So, where does this leave me in terms of what kites I prefer and in what area? Well, every review these questions seem to get harder and harder, because frankly, I've really enjoyed all of the kites I've tested the last few reviews, and the standard for kites these days just seems to keep getting better and better. Although I absolutely love this kite, it's probably not my favorite in any one specific area with my riding style. I think I do prefer it overall, however, to the Orbit Pro, probably just because it is a little lighter weight and it feels so easy to throw around even when it gets crazy windy. But for the areas these kites all specialize in the 9-meter size, kite loops and loop-related trick progression, I would probably give the slight edge to the Nitro V2 because it was a bit more forgiving and stable. But that could also be due to testing the Cabrina in fairly ideal conditions, and I would wager my opinion would sort of vary from session to session. If I was into doing double loops or riding these kites in the larger sizes, then I'd have to say the Harlem Force over the Orbit or Nitro because it gets around slightly faster, it's lighter, and it would just be a lot easier looping it in the larger sizes, I'd imagine. But the Nitro is basically fast enough for me, and its added stability gives me just a little bit more confidence. As for boosting power and hang time, none of them are quite on par with the Evo D-Lab. but they are all close enough to each other that I would wager most riders would tend to jump similar heights on each of them in similar conditions, with the edge for ease of use going slightly to the Orbit Pro and the Nitro V2 easiest of them all. What is quite wild about this kite, though, you have to remember, is that it's only the first edition, and it's already on par, if not better, than the best loopers in the game that have years of design experience behind them with this style. So for that alone, if you're a fan of the loop game, you should definitely try one of these kites if you get the chance. I'd have to imagine they are also working on something closer in style and overall performance to the Evo, given the kite's designer is also behind the technology that helped make this Force so special. Listening to the Kitesurf 365 podcast with Brainchild founder Ralph Grossel does give me a lot of hope for a more cost-effective, more durable alternative to a Lula in the near future. So perhaps we'll be seeing that from the Harlem kites first. Thank you once again for making it this far. Please fire away any questions or point out anything I missed in the comments, because I do reply to them all. Or hit me up on Instagram at Jason of Montreal. Once our windy season hits and I have a few more kites ready, my plan is to still ride all of the top few Dacron and Alula kites back to back to back on the same days in the same conditions for my Best of 2024 series. So I'm sure we'll be hearing more from some of, if not all of these kites a little later in the year. Until the next session, goodbye.